Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on another interview with a storyteller on the Tales from the Hearth podcast. Today, I am joined by Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, who is a professor at Leeds Beckett University, has been a full-time lecturer at the School of Cultural Studies there since 2007. Emily is also an expert in the role of trickster figures in the literatures and cultures of Africa and its diaspora, and has published widely in this area, most recently, American Trickster, Trauma, Tradition, and Brer Rabbit, and the one that first brought me to her insights in Anansi's Journey, a story of Jamaican cultural resistance. Emily, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to have you here. Can you tell me a little bit more about who you are and actually what has brought you to your illustrious titles and your great works of writing?
Thank you for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you. And I've always been fascinated by the trickster figure, and my heritage is half British, half Caribbean. So when I was growing up, my French Caribbean mother used to tell me stories of Anansi and of Brer Rabbit and these cunning trickster figures that would turn the tables on the powerful, using their brains rather than their brawn. So using their wisdom and their cunning and their silver tongue rather than any muscle. They tend to be small animals, the trickster characters. And I was always fascinated by that. And I think for children, those stories really connect because the children in an adult world are always trying to find ways to duck and dive and find ways around the kind of power of adults, right? How to get away with things, how to have fun, how to disappear from the surveillance of adults. I loved those stories as a child. And then when I was doing my degree, I decided to do my dissertation on the Anansi folk tales and look at their role in Jamaica and look at their roots as well, specifically in Ghana, because many of those stories in Jamaica came from Ghana. And as I was doing my dissertation, I realized that there was a real gap in the research and very little had been done connecting up the stories to their African roots and then also to looking at their role in Jamaican culture. So even though Anansi was celebrated as a Jamaican cultural hero, there wasn't a great deal of research about this trickster figure. So when it came for me to do my PhD, I went to uni and I never really wanted to leave the campus life. But when I came to do my PhD, I returned to the idea and I structured my PhD around that research. I spent 3 months in Kingston, traveling around, interviewing people to find out more about the role of Anansi in contemporary culture. And then that became the basis of my first book, the one that you've read. And then after that, I went on to look at the Brer Rabbit stories that have quite a different cultural trajectory.
There's another book I read recently. It was for a workshop called Trickster Makes the World. And it really fed off of what I was reading when I read Anansi's Journey. Is this archetype of the trickster really does have a special place in various cultures and has a special role. For those who might not be familiar with Anansi or Brer Rabbit, or even quite really understand which trickster characters they might be familiar with, I'm going to switch up this beginning a little bit. Normally, when I ask someone on, I give them a 5-minute storytelling challenge where they just, on the spot, tell a story in 5 minutes. So what I'm going to ask of you is if you can choose any Anansi tale, Brer Rabbit tale, and it doesn't have to be perfect, just to give us a sense of who and what kind of character this is.
So this is called My Old Riding Horse, and it's an Anansi story, but there is also a Brer Rabbit version of it. And it gives you a little flavor of the kind of tricks that Anansi plays. And as we'll go on to discuss further, I'm sure, is that these stories acted as a kind of wish fulfillment for enslaved people. So it's very much about turning the tables on powerful characters and dominating them. Anansi lives in a forest, and in the forest, Tiger is king. And Tiger is always making fun of Anansi. Tiger says that Anansi is the smallest and weakest spider in the forest. And nobody is scared of Anansi. And yet when he roars, the ground shakes. Anansi starts to challenge Tiger. And he calls the animals in the forest to him. And he says that actually Tiger is lying and that he, Anansi, is king of the forest, and that Tiger is making all these claims, but is in fact just his old riding horse. Tiger is incensed and sets off to Anansi's house. He reaches Anansi's house and he knocks on the door. He says, "What have you been saying all these lies about me? Come and tell the animals of the forest that these are untrue. Come and tell them that I am king." Anansi is in his house and he says in a very weak voice, "Tiger, I'm poorly, I'm sick. I can't rise from my bed. Otherwise I would come to the clearing and I'd tell all the animals that these are lies." So Tiger's furious. He says, "What am I going to do? What can I do? What can I do?" He says, "I will bring you to the clearing then so that you can tell them." So Anansi says, "Oh, the only way you could possibly do that is to let me ride on your back, Tiger." So Tiger gets down and Anansi brings his blankets out the house and he drags his feet and he looks awful and he climbs on Tiger's back. And off they go, galloping through the forest, or cantering, I'm not sure quite how you describe a tiger, running very fast to the clearing. And as we're going along, Tiger hears a little voice in his ear, and it's Anansi. Anansi says, "Tiger, I can't possibly hold on any longer. I'm slipping, I'm falling. I'm going to die. I'm going to die before we get there, and I'll never be able to tell them." So Tiger stops and says, "What is it now?" So Anansi says, perhaps just a little, I need a cushion, just a little cushion so that I can sit more comfortably on your back. Just give me a little cushion. So Tiger gets a little cushion, he puts it on his back, and Anansi sits on the cushion, and off they set through the forest, running toward the clearing. And then Anansi again in Tiger's ear, "Stop, Tiger, stop. I plead you, stop. I'll surely die before I get there. You're running too fast. I need some way to tell you that you're running too fast. Just break me off a little branch, just a little branch. I'll just hold it in my hand. And then maybe if you're going too slow, I could just give you a little tap. And if you're going too fast, then I can give you one tap." So he breaks off a little branch and off they go. Anansi again in Tiger's ear, "Tiger, Tiger, I need a way of slowing you down. You're still too fast. Just a little rope, just a little rope around your nose. That's all I need." The Tiger gets the rope, puts it around his nose. And Anansi's there, he's flopped on his back. And they finally reach the clearing. And in the clearing, all the animals of the forest are gathered. And Tiger runs into the clearing. And as they run into the clearing, Anansi sits up, his back straight. And he's sitting on his cushion and he has the reins in his hand and he has his riding crop on the side. And proud as anything, he says to the animals, "You see what I tell you? Tiger is just my old riding horse." And that's like the flavour of the sort of tricks of dominance that Anansi plays. And it's always on the ego of the powerful. Their ego becomes their Achilles heel, their pride or their greed. And then he'll manage to find a way in. But I like that story because it's the idea of the kind of the dominance and the turning of the tables and actually riding your oppressor in that way.
Yeah, that's something I love Anansi stories. I love tricksters. I regularly, whenever I'm watching a new television show or a movie, when there's a trickster character or archetypal character, that's usually, it ends up being my favorite character. And I think it's because there is this sense of subversion. I don't have to predict what they're going to do it brings spice to the story. It brings a sense of, you kind of want to root for them, even if they're doing something that's dastardly or you feel like you want the tables to be turned. My next question is actually about what brought you to this field of study and these types of stories. You mentioned how in your family, growing up, you heard these stories. What is it about storytelling and why do you study this?
I think there must be a part of me that also, like you say, I'm drawn to the trickster, and maybe I have some of those trickster qualities myself. And I think what also really fascinates me is that in all indigenous cultures, we find the trickster figure. Jung did a study of the trickster archetype. And I think it's really part of our human world. We have to adhere to certain social rules and structures of how to behave. Whereas the trickster is allowed to do anything. The trickster knows no bounds. They can, in African religions, the trickster can sleep with a deity's daughters. There is nothing the trickster can't do. So the trickster breaks free from the rules and the boundaries of human society. And I think that because we all have to adhere to these rules as human beings of behavior, we like to escape into the fantasy of a trickster. It allows us a release. And so I think indigenous cultures throughout time, across the world, sometimes there's cross-cultural fertilization, but sometimes there isn't. These tricksters are very similar. We find them in Inuit traditions, in African traditions, we find them in Native American traditions. And it's to do with that desire to escape the boundaries of the human world in that fantasy. But then my argument in Nancy's journey is that, and in the Brer Rabbit book, is that when human beings are not living in a society where they are free, or that then those stories are not just fantasies anymore, but they actually become a strategy for survival. They're actually inscribed with practical methods for people to use in their everyday lives to gain some kind of power and freedom. So it depends on the context in which those stories are told. It was that the larger interest in freedom, oppression, and resistance that fascinates me, and the way that the trickster will use any means necessary to carve themselves a space, and also operates outside of any kind of Christian framework. So it's not the moralistic good and bad. We don't interpret the trickster within that kind of moral framework. It's a far more complex and sophisticated way of thinking about the world. Something that might be good in one situation, so is different in another. In times of oppression, you have to use all the strategies available to you to survive.
I actually really loved this when I read in his journey, and you also touch upon this in American Trickster, is this transition between the types of stories that are of origin in Ghana, right, that where Anansi originated, the quality of those stories and some of the lessons from those stories changed when they came to the US in the mouths, in the storytellers that were forcibly brought to the New World. What happened in that transition and how the stories themselves changed to fit the circumstance?
There's change in a number of ways. Anansi in Ashanti culture, so Ashanti are an ethnic group that live in Ghana in West Africa. The Ashanti folktales were the dominant folktales that were brought over to Jamaica and many of the other islands as well. And those particular stories are based on Ashanti religious thought. So Anansi is a kind of intermediary figure who steals things from the sky god Nyame, the deity, and brings them down to earth for humankind, but does this often inadvertently. Brings wisdom, he brings good things, he brings stories. He is the king of all the world's stories, but he also brings diseases and serpents. But he's allowed to do anything he likes. He sleeps with Nyame's daughters, as I said before. He has a penis which is 12 foot long, and he can break it off and impregnate 12 women at the same time. There's quite a lot of kind of masculine, macho, very gendered thrust to these stories in the Ashanti context. Anansi's an intermediary figure. There aren't any shrines to Anansi, but he's very much like a part of that. And you would tell Anansi stories as a group, and often being a good storyteller, you have afforded a particularly kind of high position in Ashanti society. And an Anansi storyteller could criticize, but subtly criticize their group within the context of Anansi's story. So could say something a bit cheeky about the chief, could say something about the system that was not going right, but within the context of an Anansi story. When the stories come to Jamaica, Nyame doesn't feature anymore. There's not really that religious element. Anansi becomes more man and less spider. So he's depicted as a spider in the Ashanti stories. In the Jamaican stories, he's depicted much more as a man. Sometimes he wears a top hat. Sometimes he wears like a coat and tails. Sometimes he carries a walking stick. And the tricks that he does are pitted against Massa or Master, the plantation boss. And all sorts of elements of plantation life enter into the stories, the torture techniques that enslaved people had to endure, the whip, the chains are in there. Anansi is trying to find ways to steal food, to survive, is burning the cane fields, is stealing Massa's wife. Yeah, there's that instead of stealing Nyame's daughters. He has a family, trying to kill sheep for his family to survive and trying to break things, just trying to break things up often, create a kind of anarchic scene which really burrows away at the system from within. And then there's all sorts of foodstuffs, and Jamaican foodstuffs and Jamaican plants and flowers and that enter into the stories as well. So it very much then becomes a story of the enslaved person pitting their wits against their oppressors rather than being incorporated into a functioning culture in the Ashanti context.
This is something that I really found so powerful about this type of storytelling and how storytelling can evolve. We're often, especially in Western culture, and for me at least, speaking from US-based culture, a lot of the stories that we hear, tall tales, Greek myths, they're often whitewashed in a way where they're stripped of any controversy. You mentioned in Anansi's journey that modern day Jamaica culture and its relationship to Anansi stories has a bit of that tension between whether or not, and you mentioned this before, these are not moral tales. Anansi's journey in particular, and we see the same thing with Brer Rabbit, a lot of these types of tricks, types of subterfuge, types of breaking anarchy is rooted in survival, and these are survival techniques. How does that impact the broader culture, like mental understanding of the world and how to operate in it? And you mentioned in Anansi's journey that there is controversy around that. And much like in American society, Brer Rabbit has a very controversial root of how Brer Rabbit's been depicted in popular culture. To get into this moral gray area around tricksters, especially Anansi and Brer Rabbit, where this gray area truly comes forward as a conflict in modern culture?
Yeah, it's a really great question. The stories, they entered into the nursery of white settlers in Jamaica and Creoles in Jamaica, and they were often watered down. So if a black nanny would tell white children an Anansi story, there was a kind of watering down that might have happened in a nursery context. And then they were collected by various folklorists that tended to be white British folklorists. So those stories, the way they were transcribed, sometimes the more violent elements become edited out of the stories, the sexual elements are edited out of the stories. But in Jamaica, we had a real backlash against the stories in the 90s where a woman called Pauline Bain said they should ban the Anansi stories because actually Jamaica is a place which suffers from a lot of gun violence, from gangsterism, from greed, from this kind of heightened sense of individuality. You get everything you want for yourself at the expense of others. And these are the roots of everything that's bad about Jamaican society. So she said that we shouldn't be teaching those stories in our schools, that there should be a ban on the stories. But actually, the argument against that is that the Anansi stories are not telling you to behave like Anansi. They're a form of mental training, and that children are actually quite sophisticated in a way that they understand and interpret folk tales. The Anansi stories can also tell you how not to be the dupe, how not to be proud and not be like Snake and get tied around a bamboo pole because you're showing off that you're the longest animal in the jungle. It's about using your brains. It's not necessarily doing always as Anansi does. And the whole idea to ban a folktale, you can't ban them. They will always be told. But what we find in Jamaica is actually that those tricks of cunning, of survival, of resistance against unjust power is still celebrated. Anansi's considered a national hero. When I went there to do my research, everyone had an Anansi story to tell me. Whether it's an academics, the Maroons, who are the descendants of enslaved people, taxi drivers, school children, they love Anansi. They find the stories so funny. They're laughing, as they tell me the stories. So it's really alive. That culture is very much alive and applauded. Whereas in the American context, there's been a real rupture in terms of how the trajectory of the Brer Rabbit stories. The Brer Rabbit is a rabbit, and Anansi is a spider. But the similarities amongst the stories The Brer Rabbit stories come from, some of them are from West Africa, but a lot of them are from East and Central Africa. They come from the hare stories, but he's interpreted as rabbit in an American context. The enslaved people brought those stories over to the US, and they were told in very much the way that Anansi stories were told. One of the things that we find in the US is there is less movement of African people into the plantations throughout the period of slavery. So in some ways, there's less of a kind of renewal of African culture, whereas in the Caribbean, because the conditions are so harsh and there isn't, the population doesn't reproduce itself, sorry to have to use that language, that there are new slaves coming from Africa and bringing a lot of their African cultural traditions with them right until the end of the period of enslavement. So in America, there's less of that link with the traditional African stories. So some of those African elements, they get lost much more quickly in the American rabbit stories. Then what happens is that Joel Chandler Harris in the 1800s, in the 1880s, is a white folklorist. He takes down the stories from the mouths of plantation slaves and he publishes several collections. He becomes very well known. He does it in the vernacular of African Americans. And he does this very carefully. He's very much committed to this kind of authentic voice, but he creates a frame narrator. What he does is create a kind of Uncle Tom figure called Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus is telling the Brer Rabbit stories to a little white boy, and he's a kindly man who has been enslaved and was very happy with the system of slavery. It treated him well. So you see a hugely problematic racial stereotype. So what happened with Brer Rabbit is that actually the stories then became, in a way, a vessel for racist caricatures. So the very culture that was meant to be a culture of resistance and survival then becomes a stick which to beat African Americans down and embed stereotypes into people's consciousness.
Definitely wanted to bring that up. It's only been in the last couple of years that I even watched a Song of the South, especially in the United States. We are not given the context of where these stories were coming from. When I watched it as an adult with that context, it was shocking to see that it is so blatant in American culture of this victim blaming or putting that whitewashing of history on a character that is meant to be subversive or has that inherent subversive nature to it. You mentioned in Jamaica, there was this pushback against Anansi's stories for moralistic reasons. And in the US, there's recently, with the Song of the South, that did come back into popular consciousness, recognizing with the Black Lives Matter movement, with a lot of the Oscars so white, in terms of broader storytelling culture, how we have whitewashed what could be considered radical stories. How have you seen your research shift in especially the post-pandemic years and how these figures have reemerged, have been changed, much like they have been changed in previous decades and centuries? Do you see any kind of shift in how Anansi stories and how Brer Rabbit or other trickster tales in the Western Hemisphere or in the African diaspora, how they have changed and if they are changing?
Yeah, another really great question. I haven't been back to Jamaica for a while, but the story, people still tell Anansi stories. There's still new editions of Anansi coming out, interpreted in all sorts of different ways. I think that what's particularly been interesting is looking at programs like American Gods, Neil Gaiman, Netflix version of American Gods. And I'm actually doing a bit of research at the moment where I'm reading Neil Gaiman's American Gods novel and then comparing it to the depiction of Anansi, because Anansi appears in 3 episodes of the Netflix American Gods drama. And it's really interesting. Neil Gaiman, in his American Gods, said Anansi, he has incredible strength and he's a bit of a rebel, but he's not a revolutionary character. But the way that he's been interpreted in the Netflix series is that he's radical. He's an absolute he's a speaker of truth, but he's also like an agent of rebellion and revolt. He arrives on the ship with enslaved people crossing through Middle Passage, and he tells them to burn the ship down. And he tells them that your history will be a history of suffering for hundreds and hundreds of years. By doing that, he rouses them into rebellion. So that version of Anansi is full of the energy of the original trickster figure. Apparently, the actor was saying that it's the Black Lives Matter movement really was happening at the time of the filming, actually really inspired him to try and bring that revolutionary energy to the character on screen. Always kind of new manifestations. There's always changes. That's a wonderful thing about folk tales, about stories that people will bring to the table. In terms of Brer Rabbit, there are some fantastic Black writers like Toni Morrison, like Ralph Ellison, like Nella Larson, who've reclaimed the trickster figure, and again applauded the anarchic and revolutionary energy of Brer Rabbit in their writing. We don't end Brer Rabbit's story with Song of the South. Thank goodness. He needs to be reclaimed. Obviously can use them as commentary for contemporary culture, but links them back to the original stories. One of the things that I'm trying to do at the moment in the current piece of research that's about to be published is looking at how Beatrix Potter, the English storyteller, her Peter Rabbit stories are actually embedded in those Brer Rabbit stories. But no one ever talks about it because it's another form of cultural appropriation of Black culture. I think stories are always adapting. They're always changing. You can take from stories, but you should acknowledge your sources.
When we talk about what's radical or revolutionary, it's the root. The root gives that energy. I've seen the American Gods, that one scene on the boat with Anansi and the people being brought through the Middle Passage was so powerful. It went viral, I remember, as I recall. And Orlando Jones is the actor who plays Anansi. I remember reading or watching his take on how powerful that moment was to perform. I believe he also contributed some of the writing too, which was, I believe, another controversy that he was not appropriately credited for the writing that he did for Anansi for that show, which is a whole other level of, again, appropriation and lack of acknowledgement of Black contributors and creatives and storytellers. I've started to also look out for depictions of Anansi, Brer Rabbit, especially trickster figures from the African diaspora, because how they're being treated. Have you watched Random Acts of Flyness? It's on HBO. The latest season, it's very abstract. It's very surrealist. So each season has a different storytelling formula. The last season does include, as regular character, a man dressed up as a rabbit. And it's a recurring theme. And again, Random Acts of Blindness is written and produced by Black creatives. Terrence Vance is the program creator. You can watch the seasons separately from the other seasons, different sets of stories. But the last season really has actually a cohesive narrative. And there is that trickster character.
That's what I'm looking at the moment in music, in song, in dance, in writing, on the screen. I want to find as many contemporary versions of Anansi and Brer Rabbit as I can. So actually, if any of your listeners
if they've seen or heard any, we'll collect them. And I'll make sure to actually link some of these things that we have mentioned already, some of these stories and writings that we've mentioned already in the show notes for other people to link to or to reference. And a lot of the people that are listening are they themselves storytellers. And I think this is something that, and this comes to my next question, which I consider myself a storyteller by vocation. That's what I want to do. It's the type of craft I want to curate. And talking about this avoiding of the whitewashing and part of that is actually acknowledging, reveling in the radical nature of this archetype. Tricksters tend to be also storytellers. There's a linkage between telling of stories, telling of truths, and the trickster archetype. For me, one of the reasons why I created this podcast in particular is trying to understand and get a clearer view of what the role of a storyteller or trickster is in our society. What would you, as someone who has spent a lot of time with these characters, figures, and these stories, would you say is the role of trickster storytellers in the modern society?
Their roles change depending on the context and depending on the people that tell the stories. So the role of the trickster, and I think the role of all oral stories, really is dependent on the needs of the people that tell the stories at that particular time in history. For example, I was talking about the Ashanti context of the Ashanti storytellers, where the roots of the Anansi stories start. Now, you could argue that the trickster in that context tests the boundaries of Ashanti culture, but maybe by testing them, it also strengthens them. You go there in fantasy, you go there through the medium of the story, through the medium of the imagination. You break the rules, you say things that you're not really meant to say. You revel in the scandalous, a bit like carnival. But then you come back to the status quo. This is in the context of a society with compliant members. To a degree, I say compliant members. But when you enter into the context of enslavement, we have a monstrous, abhorrent system. So where at no point do the enslaved fully accept their conditions. I would challenge the idea that there was ever a point where somebody would accept their conditions of enslavement. So those stories then perform a type of psychological training to actually enact some of the things that Anansi does on a plantation. And they can be things like breaking machinery, rubbing salt into wounds, setting the cane fields on fire, pretending that you let the master's cows out of his field by mistake and they trampled his best canes. You look at planters' diaries. There's a particular planter called Matthew Lewis, and he writes his diaries about this time in Jamaica. And you can see that the enslaved people on the plantation are running rings round him, tricking him. He says, they know I'm a benevolent master. But as soon as he arrives, it's just a catalogue of ways in which that his power is being undermined. And there's a system of surveillance as well. And I think that's applauded in the Anansi stories. Anansi is a spider, lives up on the roof, is always watching. You can't see him, but he can see you. Slaves that were in a domestic sphere were always passing on messages to enslaved people in the fields. So there's a chain of surveillance. You think that the surveillance is the whites watching the enslaved, but there's the other way around as well. And so all of those ways of gaining power become at the core of the stories. In that context, they become both practical and psychological methods of resistance and survival. So whatever the context, the story fulfills the need. And I think that's what's so wonderful about storytelling. And not only that, but it's also a way to preserve history, especially in a predominantly oral culture. It's a link to the past, and sitting around a fire at the end of a brutal day's work, enslaved people could connect back to their roots, understand more about the culture from which they came through the medium of these stories. So there's this very strong historical and cultural kind of fulfillment too that's to be gained, I think, in those oral storytelling sessions. And there's always this sense, isn't there, that in academia, it's more challenged now that something which is oral is not as much of a reliable historical resource as the text. And I would obviously challenge that. The oral histories are just as important as textual histories.
This is actually a subject I really find interesting, because there are recorded instances where oral traditions across the world have been seen as reliable sources of history. I can't give specifics, but I remember reading, and this is something that I find very interesting, like what is this aspect of oral, like speaking to other people? And this is one of the reasons I named this Tales from the Hearth, is that the hearth fire does evoke oral storytelling traditions. And there is something about oral storytelling, also the revitalization of oral storytelling within podcasts, of what does that need serve in the context of, again, folklore, society, history building, storytelling. What is the nature of oral tradition, oral storytelling that is so captivating, that is powerful?
And I think the beauty of it is that often oral tradition is passed down, isn't it, from generation to generation. And each generation can bring something to that story and can adapt it to their particular world and bring characters in and adapt it to their significant historical events in their time. But I think as human beings, we're born into stories. Like, we tell people every day the stories of who we are. Everybody will have a story that they tell people when they first meet them about their lives. I was born here, and then I had this kind of upbringing, and then I studied here, whatever it might be. But it's a narrative that you've created around your life. And it's that narrative that how you've shaped your very identity is through that story that you tell. You don't write it down. It's an oral story. And our identities, I think, are created in that narration of stories, in that oral storytelling. And I think that we still will turn to those stories to try and understand more about where we fit into our society as a whole as well. What is the story that a society tell about themselves? What is the story about that a group tell themselves? If you change the story, if you change the narrative, it has incredible potential, revolutionary potential. So I think that's the potency of stories, and it's just as relevant today as it was centuries ago.
Truly encapsulates that same power of Anansi stories and these trickster stories. It's that potential for change, of truth, of identity, of understanding, these are such wonderful tools for us as humans to be able to use, and examples to look towards, especially in a time where many of us are seeking change and connections with other people. Absolutely. I have one last question, and it is in as archetypal storytelling way. It's the first question that I ask, which is, why are you so interested in studying these stories and these archetypes?
It's to do with the way that they've spoken to so many different cultures around the world. But also, I think that I'm fascinated as well by our will to survive and to resist. I want to try and always step away from the idea of victim, or from the idea of somebody who accepts their oppression, that there's something hard built in us to find strategies to be able to borrow the system from within and weaken it in that way. If we can't borrow it from the outside, we borrow it from within. And it's that I like to tap into. The other thing that I love about these tricksters in particular is that often the way in which they orchestrate their tricks is through language, through telling stories themselves. You said about how they were the storytellers. The tricksters are also storytellers themselves. So it's both Anansi and Brer Rabbit have a silver tongue. And it's through words and through their way with words, through their linguistic agility, that they're able to turn the tables. And in many ways, that's reflected even I was telling you about the planter diaries in Jamaican planter diaries. You can see the stories that the enslaved people are telling him, the lies that they are telling him to enable them to get a little bit more food, to get a bit of time off work. And they're very convincing. In Black diasporic cultures, this real celebration of language. You see it in hip hop, you see it in rap, you see it in storytelling. You see it when you interview people in Jamaica, in African American culture, and a real sort of natural ability to be able to hold an audience and to tell a story. And I think that it's that celebration of words, of the linguistics, of that is also so important and so central to these trickster figures that draws me so much.
Thank you. This was an excellent interview, an excellent story that we just unfolded. And I hope that it inspires those who are listening. It's definitely inspired me working with that trickster energy to change things that need to be changed, or to inspire change that needs to be inspired. With this wrapping up, thank you again. And to anyone listening, of course, you can buy any of Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall's books on Amazon. I've been able, for those who use Amazon, you can find them at other book retailers. I highly recommend. They're great books, great reads. Even if you're not an academic, these are great stories, great books. So I highly recommend them. And I look forward personally to seeing your new research as well in the future.